Welcome all of you. We've got some great brains to pick here, lots of experience to talk about. And I thought actually I'd start with you, Caroline, because we're talking about the importance of investment in journalism. And in that story that I've just mentioned, you were plugging away at it for more than 2 decades. So tell us a bit about that, the tenacity that's required and the investment that's required for something like that.
Well, if you'd have told me as a 21-year-old reporter that the first story that I ever wrote about, I would still be writing about 25 years later, I wouldn't have believed you. It was almost by fluke that the first ring-in that I got as a regional reporter at the Sunday Mercury newspaper in Birmingham was from a chap who I'm very proud to say is still with us and somebody I speak to still today, a chap called Mick Mason, who told me the most unbelievable story about how he had been infected with hepatitis C and HIV after receiving contaminated blood products. And he'd just received the news when he called me to tell me that the hospital had just rung him to say that there was a good possibility he'd also contracted variant CJD, which in old money was mad cow's disease. And I really did think at the time that my news desk were having a bit of a laugh. And it was some kind of test to see whether I knew what was fact and what was fiction. But actually everything that he told me turned out to be true. And I think it was something that was so fantastical as a sort of young reporter, something that was so obviously wrong and such a clear and apparent scandal. But yet it had been relegated to this kind of like, oh, nothing to see here. It was terrible what happened to them, but we can't really help them. You know, we did our best for them. They were poor haemophiliacs, lots of them, and we gave them this cutting-edge treatment, and oh, isn't it a shame that lots of them died? And I suppose just the injustice of it all kind of led me to want to pursue it more. I kind of realised quite quickly that most scandals in this world either start or end, often end in Westminster. And I wanted to be part of the mix. So I was incredibly fortunate as a regional reporter when there were these brilliant trainee schemes that were on offer at the time. I'm not sure that we get so much of that any longer, particularly in the regional press. And I got to go and cover a broadsheet, do a court reporting, do a free sheet, do a evening news paper as well. So it gave me all sorts of experiences. That kind of led to me coming to work in the national media and being able to give the campaign that sort of began as this 21-year-old a bigger and bigger platform as I sort of moved up through the different newsrooms. Now, I'd love to be able to tell you the story has a kind of happy ending. It doesn't at the moment. We're still fighting. They have this big sum of money that we managed to win for them, this £11.8 billion. But we found out last week that they are now saying it's going to take them another 4.5 years to pay that money. Sadly, they're dying at the rate of 1 every 4 days. Those who had children who were infected in the 70s and 80s, these were including children who were deliberately infected because they were part of clinical trials that neither they nor their parents knew about. Many of them are in their 70s and 80s now, and they are also dying. A mum died last week who both her husband and her 2 sons were infected, including one who had passed away a few years ago. So we still need to get this story on the front page of every newspaper, and I will be eternally grateful for the support and encouragement I was given, particularly last year for the Sunday Times Bloody Disgrace campaign, that we managed to bring a subject and a story which I think so many people had kind of forgotten about, back into the spotlight and to really project it, because that is what public interest journalism should be about. And we had great feedback from our readers about what we'd done. It was a story that they really engaged with. They realised that it was a scandal. They were actually writing comments on our story saying, you should be doing more on this, you should be putting it on the front pages more. So I personally believe, wholeheartedly in the kind of incredible power of journalism and the fact that really it is one of the very few ways in which you can put some exposure and sunlight on things which otherwise would never get that kind of traction. And that is one of those examples. That story was going nowhere until about 5-6 years ago, and then we gave it rocket fuel, and see what's happened.
Thank you. And that, the phrase that you used, nothing to see here, is the thing that stops things being exposed. And Sam, I mean, you've obviously got so much experience in journalism of that sort of thing. You know, once the stories are established, everybody watches and says, well, how was that not being noticed? How was that going on for so long? It's only down to the tenacity of journalists and the resources that involves that leads to the exposure in the end.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think it's a combination of extraordinary tenacity and professionalism and hard work, a bloody-mindedness, and actually resilience, because I'm sure there are many periods in your career where, you know, this didn't look like it was going to get over the line, right? And you kept on going. And I think that there is at its core, despite all of the heat that journalism takes in many people who do this job, a kind of moral core that the world really needs right now. And the work that is done, I'm not saying, obviously, you know, I'm not kind of like curing cancer or saving children's lives, unfortunately. I wish I were. But indirectly, the work that is often done in seeking the truth and having that tenacity and that backbone, that self-belief, a belief in what's right, is really what makes, you know, democracy good, what makes the world good. And so it's a little bit of magic, I think, in just kind of relentlessly continuing when you think you have something at stake that really, really matters, like that story and some of the stories that I've worked on, and I don't always get it right. But when I feel in my gut that I need to chase that, then I will chase it until the last breath.
And Henry, we were hearing from Caroline of how she started in local news. So many journalists do. It's where you have the training ground and also that direct connection with people just calling their local newsroom. How important is it that that stays sustainable?
Well, I think it's hugely sustainable. I mean, I think local news is obviously a sector that's been talked about in terms of its challenges, but has actually got a brighter future than people anticipate. So I think the outlook is a bit more positive in terms of the sustainable model. It's certainly got a lot of life in it. But, you know, back to the point, you know, I think a good local news brand is absolutely fundamental to a well-functioning local community, you know, and the civic binds that a local community needs. And, you know, we don't do high impact stuff at a national scale, but we probably do 50,000 local stories a month, and that's, you know, calling out wrongdoing, that's celebrating local heroes, that's galvanizing the community behind, you know, important local causes, whether that's fundraising for the local hospice or what have you. So, you know, I think at a local level, and it's more outside of London that exists in the UK. London is not a great market for community news brands, but if you venture, as many of you hopefully do outside London, you'll see the vibrancy of those local news brands in terms of their role in local democracy.
And what you're talking about there actually is a lot of sense of community, obviously, and kind of feel-good stuff. So does that help with getting the brands on board?
Yeah, I think it's probably, I mean, Damon can comment, but I would say it's easier for local news brands to provide a more family-friendly, brand-safe environment, because the nature of the content that we do is by its nature community-focused. You know, we're not covering the Ukraine war. You know, we're covering more charity, more, as I said, there's probably more good news. So, yeah, I would say naturally local news is an easier brand-safe environment. Sometimes, unfortunately, the agencies don't often take that line, even with local news, which is part of the challenge that we're talking about.
Do you want to pick up on that, Damon?
The brand safety point?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a difference in the workflow and the way in which advertisers reach audiences, local versus the nationals. And I think that the biggest challenge is more of an infrastructure challenge for sort of maybe the bigger buyers and the nationals when it comes to something like brand safety, where technology has disintermediated most of the decision making. So someone who is in control of where money is spent doesn't see the impact of the decisions that they make. There's a bunch of different technologies that they work with that sit in between that divorce them from the reality of the decisions. And so the education that goes on to try and get people to use the technologies and use the platforms that they use in the right way, it's quite difficult to get them to see the benefit of or understand the consequences of the decisions they make.
Can you tell us a bit more about your experience, Rob, in terms of hard news and advertisers and how that
yes,
relationship's gone.
Certainly. Firstly, this is an important room because, excuse me, we talk to advertisers all over the world, and what happens in the US and the UK echoes out. So the decisions that are made here can affect buying in Japan or the Middle East or so on. So the fact that these studies are coming out and that we're solving, I think there's a technical side to all of this in terms of the ad blockers that are blocking content, but there's a very human side to it around getting research out there, educating people. I think the human side as well is the CEO and the C-suites get this, and the research tells that, but at an operational level, I think there's still a gap. So the hardcore buying level and the operational level still need that education, need to know that they're going to be okay if they spend on news, and they're not going to be punished, there's not going to be a problem. So I think work like this is really important in the UK because we don't want it to spread even further, where we already are having discussions like this around the world. And in terms of as a commercial team, I'm looking at the room here, I've been at CNN 10 years, I think 11 years, 8 years, 7 years. We care about what we do. We're sellers, but we are... we're very aware of our purpose. The money that we generate for advertising funds this incredible journalism, whether it's Christian Ampel on the front line, whether it's Richard Quest doing a business story, whether it's something in sport, the F1, which I like, whatever it is, we're funding that. So we're motivated by that. So you can imagine, in a world where 8 years ago, it's like you wouldn't be in trouble putting CNN on a campaign, right? Or any of us. That would just be part and parcel of the industry. So it kind of hurts a bit suddenly being told, hang on, you're going to block us, but you're very happy to spend 80% of your budget in a platform where, there's even less no moderation, but you're going to block us. So, it's quite challenging and even hurtful, I would say. So, what we need to do in the way we try and put ourselves out there is there are plenty of brands out there and people that do care for the world. They care for their purpose beyond profit, whether that's doing something good for climate, DV&I, whether that's something to forward technology to solve healthcare problems, whatever it is, we align ourselves with, hey, if you've got a trusted story to tell as a brand, you need people to get behind. And we know that consumers do buy based off how their brand, how they feel about a brand, whether it aligns with their own values. Let us tell that story for you. So that is really where we're at around doing branded and sponsored content and stories for these brands. But we're often also just at the very sharp end, the UK in particular, of just being blocked, particularly on the programmatic side, through blunt tech tools that may have keywords. Things like football publishers have almost been hit the hardest with this stuff because they've got words like shoot and attack in their journalism, right? So you think it's just hard news being blocked? It's not. It's too blunt, and that's where the human side comes into it. It's all very well having the tech tool, but the human side is really important around education, research, and conversations like this.
Gideon, we were hearing from James and Alexis about the extent of the research that has been done. Is that enough now, do you think, to make it a no-brainer and just to sell it?
Well, for the journalists here, we think it's a no-brainer, but let's be real, no, it's not a no-brainer because the advertisers have a lot of choice. And historically, if we were half a century ago, sort of 70% of advertising money went into news and magazines, newspapers and magazines. Now it's in the region of 3-4%, very roughly. And Group M, which is the biggest media buyer in the world, they testified to Congress that only 5% of their clients' money, this was last year, goes into news, and only 1.28% goes into online news. And the message was that advertisers have lots of other choices, and I think they've forgotten really their social responsibility, and often they're looking for cheap, quick reach. They're looking for the audience, not the context. And if I could use a sort of marketing analogy, good journalism takes time. It can take decades. Computer Weekly took the best part of 15 years from when they first started writing about it. I know when the Sunday Times did the story about Russell Brand, that took about 4 years. These things take time, and marketers and brands, they want a return today, they want a return tomorrow. They've got the next quarter to think about. And I think that's the biggest challenge, honestly, that we wouldn't be having this discussion if if you like, the ad industry had woken up.
come back.
Yeah, I think James probably hit the nail on the head earlier when he spoke to say that the moral argument, which was the first phase of the sort of Stagwell research moving into the business argument, it's the business argument that moves advertising spend. Whether we would love to think that moral arguments are going to shift buyer behaviour, but it doesn't. People need to see the business outcomes and the business impact to know that they can move money away from Meta, they can invest in news brands, and they will get the same business outcome or a better business outcome. And I think that that's the job that we need to do to demonstrate the business impact, the positive business impact that comes from investment in news.
Just to build on that, I think that, you know, our business very much now has to be led on insight-led selling through data that proves what we've done has worked before, or is going to prove before they've spent that it's going to work, and then afterwards proving as well. So if you look at the makeup of our business, and we still need to get sharper at it and better at it, we don't have the same level of data as some other platforms out there, but it's still an area where we have to invest in more than ever. And our business, if you look at it 5 years ago, it's a completely different makeup than what it is today because of exactly this. We have to, and it makes sense, right? We have to prove if someone's going to spend 7 figures with us, we have to prove it's going to work.
Caroline, are these conversations that you're kind of familiar with in the newsroom?
I'm actually happy to say no, because actually there is a real division of labour here, which is we don't have conversations about advertising in the editorial newsroom because we believe that we have a trusted brand, that we are independent, that we are fiercely independent, and that we shouldn't be influenced in terms of our news judgments by whether or not people spend money with us. And I can't ever think of a story that I was ever told not to pursue because it was going to annoy one of our advertisers. And particularly, you know, if I think about, you know, even the contaminated blood story, I mean, there was a moment where it went through my head. I was thinking, gosh, literally, these are all the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Some of these pharmaceutical companies also make makeup. And is this going to be something that's going to get in the way of this investigation? Nobody ever mentioned it. And I think that that is why it's so important that these two strands are distinct from each other, because then that's where you build the integrity into your brand. And I think, obviously, for the Times and the Sunday Times, having that trusted brand is incredibly, incredibly important, because that, in many ways, is our sort of USP, and that's how we are seeking to stand out in a really, really, really diverse media market at the moment.
Yeah, and that's the important thing to remember, isn't it, Sam? I mean, it's the sort of gold standard, I suppose, news environments versus the unmoderated news environments, and things can get a bit muddied out there, I guess, in terms of perception and what you trust or don't.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think one of the biggest challenges for us as kind of like organisations has been, you know, MSM, mainstream media, like everything being put together. So while democratisation of news has brought some fantastic opportunities, particularly during like the Arab Spring, for example, it's obviously also brought some big challenges for more traditional news brands. I think really, though, that if you imagined that if in the newsrooms that we've worked in, there was a moment at which we had to consider fear and favour of, you know, a brand, nothing would ever get done. And so, in a sense, keeping these kind of like the walls apart, the business and the moral argument, obviously, you know, the moral argument, it's, you know, it's a really kind of like different set of considerations to a newsroom where you just are kind of like fearless or ridiculous or foolhardy or all of those things, but that is what gets you to the truth, because every story both of us have done would be Big Pharma or the royal family or institutions or big business. You know, we would never be able to publish everything or anything if we had to concern ourselves with these matters, which is a challenge for us as a brand in terms of looking for business and future opportunities. I can see the problem.
Mm-hmm. But the bit that there's always an awareness of is the level of resourcing. So whether you're considering where it's coming from, forgetting about the fear or favour, there has been a bit of a sense that sometimes established news has been perhaps taken a little bit for granted, and it's the area that's cut, it's not the area that's invested in.
But I think it's chicken and egg as well. I appreciate absolutely what you were saying about it's a business argument first, but then it becomes a moral argument. I think you could go back to this on DEI issues, for example, where when we were talking about women in the workplace, first of all, we had to make the business argument. And then whether the moral argument follows or not, who cares, as long as there are women there? Or, you know, kind of, so I feel that perhaps they become intrinsically linked. So once people have the business argument with the figures, to have affiliation with individuals who are trying to do right by, you know, the underserved, the ruined, the disparaged, people who've been relentlessly attacked, people who need to be called to question, to be on the right side, that truth revolution, as I've called it, that is a brand that you want to be affiliated with in business terms and in moral terms.
Mm-hmm. You're all nodding your heads.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Hitting up for anything
in the lead conference, Advertising Association conference, a little while ago, a month or so ago, all of the platforms were on stage, sort of supposed to be justifying their defence as to why they removed moderation and a lot of the controls to give advertisers reassurance, which I don't think they did a particularly good job of reassuring anyone. But one of the comments that seemed to recur off the back of that was from a media buyer's or planner or buyer's point of view, which is I don't get sacked for keeping Meta on the plan, but I do get sacked if I don't hit my targets. And I think that and that is a business reality. So they may have a moral argument, but the moral argument doesn't mean much if they don't hit their targets. And so I think that being able to prove and demonstrate value within news environments, which I think we're all everyone in this room probably believes is true, we have to demonstrate it and prove it in an industrial way, in the same way that the Metas and the Googles do, to underpin why the moral argument stands.
And the survey data is very clear. I mean, if you survey the British public, and certainly for local news brands, which I'm familiar with, they will say that 81% of the British public trust the news and content that they see in a local news brand. And if you ask them the same question about social media, it's less than 30% and declining. So, the data is very clear in terms of trust, and that's got to have a beneficial value for the advertising environment.
Do you have any sort of good examples from your area of where brands have particularly benefited from being linked?
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, we have about 6,500 display advertisers a month, local ones. Mm-hmm. So, and they are pretty much month in, month out advertisers, sometimes seasonal, but they come back because it works for them. And that, but they're only spending £2,000 a month. If you look at the national agency examples, probably the best recent example was last year. We with a lead advertising partner for the NSPCC, the leading children's charity in the UK, and we ran a massive ad campaign over 11 months for them. And they did a lot of research because it was a high-value campaign, and in news brands, principally online, but also in print. And the TGI data said that the Newsquest campaign increased the propensity to donate to the NSPCC by 34% over an 11-month period. And the control group, i.e. What was the general change in UK's citizens' attitudes to donate to charity was only 3%, so we gave them 34%. And they also measured brand warmth. That was a new term for me, but apparently that's what ad agencies like. And the brand warmth to the NSPCC increased by 52%. So, and, around the big ad campaigns, as Damon knows, there's a lot more research than the local ones. I say the local ones, it works because they keep coming back and they're entrepreneurial businesses. And then obviously ad agencies use the type of TGI research that NSPCC did. So I think the case is very clear. It's just trying to get the ad community to get off their butts. They're a bit lazy sometimes and put more money into news brands and not Meta.
Do you have good examples, Ron?
Hundreds. But my favourite one, I'll just pick a couple, maybe just focus on one, was during the Trump-Biden debate in the US, we saw the first spot TVC ad, so first TV ad that you saw on the break was for Turkey tourism. And the context was, well, this is all going on, why don't you consider a holiday to Turkey? And it was a brilliant bit of marketing. People picked up on it. It became viral on social media, obviously, quickly, although it was a TV ad, just like the debate itself, it very much becomes a digital event as well, very quickly. And they had a 16% increase in Google searches, for Istanbul, for Turkey, over the coming 10 days. They also had 240 pieces, it would have got otherwise around, in terms of content on Istanbul being the new core in Turkey and so on. So just fantastic bit of aligning against something which many people did not want to align themselves
and
against.
Surely that's a challenge that will whet the appetites of advertisers who are in a creative business. There's a big prize if you get the creativity right on something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really creative buying of a traditional ad. I mean, the other see that, from the UK, people like Vive Healthcare, which GSK company, they want to be aligned, the audiences that we have on news because it's trusted, they're engaged in all of these areas. But then people like Samsung, one of the biggest spenders in the world, they work with us to tell stories about how their tech is solving problems and align themselves with the sponsorship of a Tech for Good program, and as well a digital series where we tell stories about how they're using, they're dredging up old fishing nets from around South Korea and using and turning some of those parts into pieces within their mobile phones. There's a beautiful story there of people diving to get these nets, solving a problem for the environment, and then also ending up in a consumer phone, which is relevant in any market around the world. So, and that firmly fits in a space where, news brands can play.
So Gideon, back to what you were saying then about there being this lag. Is this the sort of stuff that helps to bridge the gap? What can be done? What needs to be done?
Well, I think more discussions and research like this, because, if you, again, and not to dwell too much on the past, but there was a massive lack of collaboration between news organisations in the past. This is how Ozone, where Damon works, came about. And it's great that news organisations are competitive, but actually when your share is shrinking and actually you're all trying to tell advertisers, look, think about where you invest. Advertisers are very aware about the company they keep, and trust in a lot of journalism actually is high, despite all of the criticism. And interestingly, trust in advertising is beginning to increase as well, which I think is fascinating, actually, because, when you take things like the Edmund Trust Barometer, things like some research that Channel 4's done with young people, you can see that there's been, trust in government's gone down, trust in business in some ways has gone up, trust in the media it's fascinating, I think, that, the people are both media literate and confused in this modern era. And I think media organisations have a role to play. That's both the creators of media and the advertisers, and thinking, who do we want to support? What's the media ecosystem we want? And it's good to get more brands talking about it. You get financial services brands, they're all advertising ISAs and things like that at this time of year. Where do they advertise? They advertise in news brands because they want that trusted environment.
What moments have given you most hope, Sam, about journalism's ability to drive positive change?
I just think ultimately at its core, a lot of journalism drives a lot of positive change all the time, but we kind of close our eyes to it somewhat. And I think this process of journalism being so challenged and under such threat has reminded people to open their eyes to the things that really matter. So I'm sure with the work that you've done and with the work that I've done, I've had an overwhelmingly positive response. I get stopped in the street and, obviously, sort of like the personal element aside, there's profound and lasting change that comes from these stories. So whether or not it does take 20 years, or in my case it was 13 months of negotiation and 15 years of nobody knowing what the toot I was up to, or whether it's the post office scandal, whatever these stories are, we know inherently that these stories coming into the public realm are a force for good, and the things that make this country great, and we care about those things. We can get distracted easily by, easy tropes about kind of behaviour and when things go wrong. But I really am hopeful. I meet a lot of young, I teach at LSE. I meet a lot of young journalists. People still want to be journalists, which is great, quite shocking. And, I was at a thing this weekend with about 100 young journalists, and they are full of hope and optimism. They believe in truth, and they believe in democracy. They believe in accountability. They're passionate and compassionate. And that gives me a lot of hope because, that's really what we need in these troubled times.
Do you want to come in on that as well, Caroline?
The one thing I remember more than anything else was I've also written a book on the contaminated blood scandal, and when we first sent it out to publishers, nobody wanted to publish it, and they said it was because it lacked hope and was entirely bleak. I found that incredibly painful at the time, because we were campaigning and we had moved something from something that we were howling in the wind over. I mean, literally howling in the wind. We would get, comments from the Department of Health that would say, we've already addressed this. We've set up this compensation scheme or that compensation scheme, which was an ex gratia payment of a couple of £1,000 to fix somebody's washing machine, or, to give them a funeral fund or something of that nature. And we'd moved this kind of incredible boulder up the hill to kind of get it accepted that this was something they needed to look into, to get that public inquiry in the first place, to then get that phone call from them the government then talking about liability, which was the first time that the idea of compensation, that they might actually pay compensation, had been talked about, to getting to the end of that public inquiry, which was, an incredible outpouring of grief around what had happened. But actually, there was no greater catalyst for hope than the fact that this very, very neglected group of people who, could very hardly garner a kind of front page newspaper in any story, and were struggling to be heard, were suddenly on the front page of every newspaper. They were leading the Today programme. They were on ITV. They were on Channel 5. They were on every broadcast channel there were. And for me, that just gives me such hope that actually this can happen with other scandals, with other things that perhaps would be left, uncovered, without some journalist somewhere picking it up and saying, actually, this is wrong. And for every me, or for every Sam, or for every other reporter, I reckon there are millions of stories, personal instances of things where there has been great injustice done that don't get the kind of attention that they would do if it weren't for tenacious reporters, young reporters all over the country that pick something up, get that gut feeling and think, we've got to do something about this. And that is the power of public service journalism. And, for all the great scoops I get, from the government leaking us something, finding out what's going to be in the budget, or, what's happening with the defence spending review, there is nothing that compares to that story for me, because it actually affected change. It made a difference. We did something that we didn't think we would have ever achieved, and it's really changed people's lives, or at least it would if the government could just listen and sort out the issues that I've outlined to you already. But for me, there is still great positive hope in terms of the future for public service journalism.
I'm taken by what you said as well about that. Well, we don't want to publish that because where's the hope? And a lot of people say, news, it's all doom and gloom, don't watch it, don't listen to it anymore. But what you're talking about there is its humanity. And what we saw with the post office was very similar, something that went on for years and years and years. It cut through, really, when an ITV programme was made called Mr. Bates and the Post Office.
So if anybody wants to fund an ITV drama, BBC drama, any other drama into the contaminated blood scandal, please do. We understand there is one in the pipework, but it needs to happen today or tomorrow, not in 3 years' time, because we need the spotlight on this issue right now.
Well, that's probably a good moment to throw questions out to you. If you have any ins with any programme makers for Caroline, or any other questions for any of our panel, we'd love to hear your questions.
Hi there, it's a great panel. Learned and really seen how it's sort of shone a light on the issues we've got. And I think it was from the initial, sorry, it's David from NBC Universal as well. In the initial presentation, there's a piece around how brand safety values have been over-applied. Whereas I think there's actually a disconnect there, and perhaps they've been over-applied to us and under-applied in other areas. It's almost like the smartest kid in the classroom is being punished by the teacher when the feral kids are allowed to run riot. And I think Sam's point was a really good one, in the sense that the playbook that was in place for ESG is something that we could perhaps learn from, in the sense that it's been the audience and change from individuals that has driven businesses to think about the impacts on share prices. Whereas if we're just making the case, it's just, we will say that because we're publishers, but it's how can we persuade the hearts and minds of audiences to see that news is really crucial to their well-being and their future.
Who do you want to put that to, or who wants to answer that, perhaps?
Anyone who wants to take a stab would be
happy
great.
to comment. I absolutely agree. I think that the comment I made earlier about the division of responsibility or division of labour within advertising today, where the person who makes the decision about what brand safety rules are applied has no relationship to the business impact, whether that's on the publisher side or actually on the brand side. And I think that that's a big part of the problem that I think needs to be addressed. Research like this really puts the spotlight on it and speaks to the CMO. And I think that the decision making starts there, and fingers crossed that then flows through the ecosystem and ultimately to benefit publishers. The challenge with the technology, which I know that you know this, is it started out as a text-based technology and never really evolved very well beyond that. So if you're the proprietor of words, then you stand to be disadvantaged. And that's just an unfortunate kind of output of the technology and how it's used. Hopefully that will change.
Well, I was just going to say one thing where it may seem obvious, but it's worth remembering. Journalism is brand safe for a reason. It's been through a lot of checks to get to the point of publication, and it's often forgotten, right? You can get sued. There's a massive bar that any respectable news organisation has to pass to put something out, and it's not something that's often remembered, and the machines definitely don't really understand that. It's the sort of whole industrialization of media has definitely neglected quality and originality.
Thank you so much. This was a great panel. I really appreciated it. I want to address just what I believe is the elephant in the room, which is young people. Young people, yes, I think there's a great point about trust, that trust is still high in the media, but young people's attention is not in the mainstream and large media companies, and it asks questions about long-term sustainability for many of these large companies. What do you think needs to be done with brand marketing to attract more young people and retain them?
I'll jump in a little bit. I'll pivot a little bit to the commercial side. I think just because CNN is a legacy brand 44 years ago, first 24-hour news channel, the reason why we still thrive today is because we have to innovate, so we have to listen to young people and be where young people are, which is a challenge when it seems everything changes so fast today, whether it's technology, new platforms, and also the commercial model, right? To have a sustainable commercial model, which is part of your question, ultimately means we need to be where the audience is. I think one of the things we need to be really careful of is not, excuse me, my hay fever kicked in today. I'm not sure if anyone else has. I'm actually pleased I haven't been sneezing for half an hour. But a lot of news brands actually, to reach younger audiences, did rush out. I won't name them, but you can probably think of them. They were going to be the new CNN, and they built their business models on someone else's platform. As soon as you do that, you are beholden to someone else's business model. An algorithm can completely change your commercial foundation. And that means you've got to have when they talk about sustainable business models, you've got to have many facets to what you do to generate revenue. Advertising is just one of them. But that doesn't mean we're not using those platforms for us. I have 5 people on my team that all they do is push out, understand data and audiences from CNN, but also the broader Warner Brothers Discovery audience, which is billions of followers. CNN has, I think, 250 plus million followers across various platforms. We can use that and make that work for us as well. So although you can be guilty of bashing these platforms as media owners, actually there are opportunities there as well. We create videos for our clients. Those places are very noisy. If you marry their brands with the 3 letters of CNN, you're going to cut through, and you're going to add a layer of trust in an environment where perhaps people aren't thinking it's trusted. So, really we need to understand these platforms, be there, make them work for us on the commercial side in a way that complements what we do, and also use them, of course, as great marketing platforms to bring new audiences to our core, because our website, our fast channels, our streaming services, whatever it is always needs to be at the core of what we do, so that we're beholden to the core of our business model. Answer your question, kind of? Yeah?
Thank you. Probably time for a couple more questions. Yep.
Hi, Prayer from Reuters. I'd love to know your perspective on attention metrics, with the likes of Adelaide and Lumen, and if that can actually be used as a real tool to convey deep engagement. We partner with Adelaide, and we're finding that is helping us. But we are having to educate the market about that. I'd love your perspectives.
I'll go. I get, from an Ozone point of view, I think intention metrics and any marketing metrics are super important and really valuable in terms of helping an advertiser to understand the difference between the environment and the content that might be long-form content that's produced versus other content, which relies more on ad tech metrics and clicks and stuff like that, which we're all trying to move away from. While that is really important, the next phase, which again, coming back to what James is sort of talking about, the next phase is trying to demonstrate more effectively the business impact that advertising within news environments actually has for the brand. That requires a different set of analytics and marketing tools to be able to do that, and it requires interaction with the brand themselves. There's probably, up until I'd say maybe a year ago, most brands I'd say were less interested in wanting to engage. They engaged with Facebook and Google, and they were happy with that. What we've experienced at Ozone is an increasing level of brands and marketers wanting to engage with others to understand the real impact, business impact for them of advertising in your environments, which I think is just a really positive thing.
Thank you. Okay, you wanted a question, didn't you? And you as well. So we'll go to you next. And
thank you. I just had a build on the previous question around engaging young audiences. Sam, you talked about the hope of young journalism. Clearly, news is more of a legacy industry. So I wanted to know what are you doing in order to embrace the hope of younger journalism, and also how that might involve younger readers as well?
Yeah, I think the truth is you have to show some humility in this, because obviously what we were consuming is very different to what they might consume. So I'm always looking for the commonality. So the commonality, I suppose, in that audience is ultimately we like to tell stories, and we're nosy. And we want to be paid to tell stories and be nosy. So the stories that they're telling maybe are for a shorter period of time, or they may tell them in a different way from the traditional ways that we may have been brought up on. And nobody panic, but I was not trained in journalism. But there we are. But I think still they have that kind of like feeling that they're on the side of right, that they're trying to tell a story that matters to them and to their community, whatever their community is. That they see geopolitical issues and they are fearful, and in a sense that puts rocket fuel under that desire and that interest. And ultimately what I'm very careful to do is not to do that kind of trite intergenerational thing, because I teach 18 and 19-year-olds. I don't want to come in and make assumptions about them, and reciprocally, I don't want assumptions made about me. So we try to find a place where they can tell me about how they want to tell stories and do them, and I don't come at them with, well, you should do it this way. I come at it with, oh, show me how I could tell my story your way. So I think in that lovely space between our generations where we have commonality and passion, that's where the magic can be made, but I'm not prescriptive, and I'm still learning. You know, I'm an old dog with new tricks, thanks to those young people. So I'm looking for those new tricks, and they want my old tricks, so together we've got mid-tricks.
Thank you.
Can I just add, so we at Newsquest run something called the Newsquest Young Reporter Scheme, which is hugely popular. It's basically the largest work experience program for budding school children journalists in the UK. And I had a review actually with the lady who runs it for us this morning, and she said it's never been more popular. So she's now sort of been inundated by schools. So I think there has been a sea change, what she was articulating to me, a sea change since before COVID, when there was much more doom and gloom and parents were sort of going, why would you want to go into journalism? It looks like it's a contracting career, etc. And something has been ignited, I think, amongst the youth, which maybe you talked to about them being more appreciative of the truth and the value to society that journalists brings. Also, possibly, they see the opportunity of transferable skills in journalism to social media as well, I think. So I think, whereas, 15 years ago, journalism training, it was journalism, but now I think quite a lot of young people come into journalism and go, well, I'd like to do journalism, but it's also going to introduce me to social media marketing, and so much of advertising marketing is around content now. So I think that is a positive force that's actually encouraging quite a lot of young people to turn to journalism in the last few years. That's what we see anyway.
Just add something, because I think it's a really important point. One, can you come and talk to me afterwards? Because I reckon you seem like some of the authority, so maybe you should talk to us. But I think, Sam, you're a good example, because I think we do understand, and you've read that your audience is a one-to-one relationship with you. We were talking about your personal brand, and I think, we know that younger audiences have these very deep personal relationships with user-generated content that are personality-led, where they get that kind of one-to-one relationship. They feel like they're their friends, or they've grown up with someone, or whatever it is. And we have examples of that, things like Anderson Cooper's Griefcast and the podcast. But that's where we need to get better at understanding that as well. And I think you're going to see news brands be more into that space, and that's certainly a mission that we're on as well.
Hi there. So Tim Brown, well, thank you first of all. Tim Brown, son of a journalist who started his life at, I think it was Stoke-on-Trent, the local newspaper in Stoke-on-Trent, and ended up in advertising. So the opposite to you, Joanne. Exactly. So actually, Damien, a question for you. So we heard Group M, I think it was 2-3% of ad spend. We heard Stagwell has got a target of, I think, was it 22%, 21 to 22% in news. So what should the target be? And what
100.
Yeah. And some justification. I mean, clearly we've heard moral reasons, but what
should the number be?
What should the number be? Yeah.
Well, maybe a slightly different way of answering the question. So when we started Ozone, the ambition that I had. For those that don't know, Ozone is owned by 4 of the national news brands here. So it's a joint venture between the publishers to try and be more competitive in what has become a platform world. At that time, the share of advertising by news brands was, I think, around 12%. That includes print. It's now, as Gideon said, below 5%. So more than halved in the time that Ozone has been able to. We've generated probably more than I know exactly how much, more than 300 million in advertiser billings in that time. So on the one hand, we feel like we're filling the pot, but the pot's getting a lot smaller very quickly. At the time, if we'd set out to say, the ambition was to grow that share of investment. If we could have held steady and said, let's keep it at that 12% number, I think everyone would have been really happy. It depends a lot on the role that publishing plays within the media mix. And I think, for me, this is where I feel like the way in which the way in which the advertising system is architected today, it massively devalues and undervalues journalism and publishing. To change that requires the underlying architecture to change. I'm personally of the view that a lot of the technologies that were built that ultimately devalued publishing were owned by a lot of the technology companies that are now the big players. As that democratizes and a lot of those technologies that we all know about, the large language models and stuff like that, start to be used by others in planning and buying, and I know that Stagwell is kind of one of those, then all of a sudden I think the environments that publishing create start to stand on their own 2 feet and don't get pushed to the side. So actually I think over the next few years the likelihood is that's going to go up significantly. I don't know whether I could put a figure on it, but I'd hope that it would get back to the 2018 levels.
Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, a hand up. Yeah. And I think.
Hello, I'm Madeleine Dowd. Sam, I'm one of the newly qualified hopeful journalists from last weekend. With things like the blood scandal and the royal scandal, it's very easy to appreciate why good stories take time. But I was wondering, in today's news environment where stories have to come out so quickly, how does quality journalism still cut through with trust?
Well, I think you sort of answer your own question there in some ways, because, I mean, I'm really, really fortunate in that I can go to the editor and I can say, I've got this great idea for a story, but it's going to take me a while. And I'm probably going to need you to put some money into this because it's going to take me a while and I'm going to have to potentially put somebody undercover or one of those things. But he knows at the end of it that we'll get a great product and we'll get a great story to tell, and it will be something that we can really buy into. But I think certainly for some of those stories, like, for example, the blood story, or, I mean, the story that also caused me great grief was exposing the spy ring in the heart of Westminster. That took weeks and weeks and weeks, and that meant that I couldn't go and do the kind of day-to-day. I had to be off diary and basically only focusing on that one story. But if you get a great brand like the Sunday Times that appreciates that those are the stories that our readers want us to tell. And the thing that's really, really encouraging about the metrics that we look at in terms of our readers is that that is why they come to the Sunday Times. They come to the Sunday Times for the investigations. They come for those longer, in-depth analysis pieces. And they come for those stories that are going to take weeks, if not years. And there have been other stories that have taken years. I mean, the story that springs to mind recently, I don't know if you guys saw it, was the Spy in the Newsroom. Which a very good friend of mine wrote, which was solving a cold case of our foreign correspondent that was murdered in Cairo. Took 50 years, but one of our journalists solved it in the end. But because we know that about our audiences, we know that they'll trust us to put our resources to best use, and they know at the end of the day that we'll end up with a story which not only shines a light on something which has, you know, huge public interest, but is also something that our readers are going to want to come and read. I think that sustains our model more than anything else. But it's also, I think it's quite inspiring as well to young journalists like yourself, because what journalist doesn't want to be investigating things? I mean, you don't want to be stuck in a newsroom sort of churning out press releases or whatever. And that's why investing in journalism is so important, because you're never going to get to those stories if you're just literally investing in people picking up pieces of paper and refiling copy that's been sent to you by a PR agency.
Because I came to journalism after another career, I was a criminal defence barrister, and I never made it to be editor or one of the lofty titles. So I was probably doing more what you will be doing when you start out. And I think I would take a twin track view. So my view was on the work that I did, that I had to just get shit out. We had to keep the programme on air. There's 48 minutes to fill. And some of it was not going to change lives. It would just be bums on seats, you know, accurate, of course, checked, but trying to get a newsline here or a newsline there. And then separately, I would have my unicorns, those lofty, ambitious ideas, one of which you guys got to hear about, but 99 that you never heard about. And so you do have to be pragmatic. Of course, when you're junior, as I was for most of my career, I just had to create content. But I would have those unicorns that sometimes I secretly kept, and I just kept chasing and chasing and chasing. So you can twin track and not lose hope for lofty ambitions, but you do just have to get shit done most of the time.
And I would just say you have to be a bit obsessed sometimes. There's no question that you don't know sometimes when you start something how long it's going to take, and be persistent. And sometimes it is about working in the evenings or on your day off, not because that's what you wanted to do, but that's the only way you're going to get there. Persistence it's always the key, really.
And I completely agree with what Sam said. I mean, there are some weeks where nothing comes off, and literally you're sitting there going, oh my God, I'm really hoping something's going to come off. And it's one of those weeks where I quite often lose my voice, and the news editor will say to me, have you had one of those weeks? Because I've literally phoned everybody in my contacts book from the beginning to the end to try and get a story, because, you know, at the end of the day, the Sunday Times is going to come out. It's not ever going to come out without any politics in it.
Well, I just told one last story, I promise it will be quick. But I had an appraisal. Do you remember, you have an appraisal? Prince Andrew never had one, but I had lots of them. And it was about 6 weeks before this landed. And I remember sitting with my deputy editor, a great guy called Stuart McLean, and it was like tumbleweed, because nothing I had worked on all year had come to bleed in anything. So it was a bit awkward. And he kind of went to me, well, maybe hopefully some stage this year something will come to fruition. And luckily, something did. But sometimes it is just tumbleweed, and you just have to have that confidence and hope that at some stage something will land.
The bit of advice I loved, it was actually in a different context, but it was, don't do something you don't like because it's too much like hard work. But when we love this stuff, you're driven, and as you say, Gideon, you don't want to take the time off because it's all about passion. So that's why we've all been here tonight, talking about the passion of the journalism and hopefully this virtuous circle going forward. It's been brilliant to hear from you all. Thank you very much. And thank you for having us, Stagwell.
Thank you.